The human soul can incarnate in both a male and a female body, but how do the qualities and characteristics of a person's soul depend on which deity the soul originally comes from, a male or a female deity? And what particular features do people with different sexual orientations acquire as a result of this? That's a good question, thank you. Actually, there are a few questions within this one, so we'll break them down and answer each one separately before bringing everything together. Yes, there is indeed such a legend and theory. And it is in fact on the basis of this legend and theory that we develop our worldview paradigm in our school. According to this legend, the human soul does not exist on its own. It is not some kind of substance that appeared from nowhere. Rather, a human soul is the manifestation of a particular god. And the legend tells us that when the gods created people, they separated a piece of their own consciousness, which then became the human soul. However, I would like to emphasize that it was their consciousness, rather than their soul, that was separated. Therefore, when a person develops their soul, they are, in fact, developing the consciousness of their God and drawing closer to them. When a human soul absorbs all the information contained within the consciousness of their God, it merges with that God, essentially becoming them and returning to its original element. Moreover, the same legend states that different deities always originate from a single plan, or a single god. For instance, the Slavic cosmogonic legend about the origin of humanity tells us that when the god Rod wanted to understand himself, he divided himself into different parts. Each of these parts then began its journey through this world, gaining independent experience apart from the other parts. In this way, various gods appeared, gods of order, gods of law, and gods of nature, each with their own distinct nature and consciousness. And the consciousness of these various deities became the material from which human souls originated. And the task of each god, and therefore of each person, remains the same: to absorb a full and complete experience in order to first unite with one's own God, from whom one originates, and then with the one God that encompasses everything. This is such an ancient Gnostic legend. Essentially, our practice of developing consciousness and the practice of developing the soul are both based on this theory. We develop consciousness with a clear understanding of where we are heading, not randomly or without purpose. In other words, we have a final destination for our journey. It is very distant, of course, but we must nonetheless strive towards it. We have a vector, and we move along it. Now, in the context of answering the question raised by our colleague Polina, logic suggests that in order to gain the full experience, one must live life in both a female and a male body. The consciousness of a god has no preference for incarnating in either a male or a female body. Consequently, for the human soul, it makes no difference in which body it incarnates. It is simply a matter of necessary experience. And if you have been incarnating in male bodies for a long time, for example, then sooner or later you will need to compensate for the missing experience. Whether the soul chooses the body it is born into is a controversial question. While the soul is young and still developing, it does not have the right to choose. The body it is born into is determined more or less randomly, let's say according to a kind of standard distribution. There must be a certain number of men and a certain number of women in the world in order to fulfill the commandment, be fruitful and multiply, and to prevent unhealthy competition within either group. So while a soul is young and passing through the stages of development, it may incarnate in either a male or a female body. However, once a soul has acquired a certain amount of experience and can independently determine what kind of experience it lacks, this choice is made by the soul itself. And so, the soul allows itself to be born, either in a male or a female body, in order to gather the necessary experience, simply to compensate itself up to a certain unit, a certain whole. In this context, people with different sexual orientations, as we now politely refer to them, are seen in a completely different light. From a mystical point of view, they are individuals who embody both the masculine and feminine aspects of consciousness. I must emphasize, consciousness, not the soul, for the soul itself has no gender. They embody both the male and female aspects of consciousness. Since ancient times, it has been believed that the consciousness of such individuals is more advanced than that of people heavily conditioned by their gender. It is thought that they can be anyone, because their soul has absorbed so much experience that their body and consciousness, adjusting to the soul, no longer perceive any difference. For example, in ancient Greece, such people were held in very high esteem. They were seen as avatars of the gods, because only a god could afford to appear in both male and female bodies at the same time. In mythology, this concept was often represented by a god who could easily change gender. For instance, the god Loki could be either male or female, performing both the female function of giving birth and the male function of fathering children. This meant that he could be both a mother and a father. And in Greek mythology, the anthropomorphic figure closest to this idea is the god Apollo, together with his twin sister Artemis. It was believed that they were, if not Siamese twins, then two halves of a single whole. If this culture, the culture of androgyny, had been preserved in our world, then the attitude towards people of different sexual orientations, such as gays and lesbians, would naturally have been somewhat different. It would inevitably have been different. And perhaps such people might even have been revered. Yet attitudes towards them have always varied, and with the arrival of Christianity, they became strictly negative. This, in turn, played a cruel joke in our time, because human consciousness is structured in such a way that it operates between two extremes, two proto-foundations, as illustrated by the three circles scheme. If we remain in a state of hatred for too long, the pendulum will inevitably swing back towards love. Conversely, if we love something for a very long time, the pendulum will eventually swing towards hatred, and typically, both positions are extremely biased. In fact, just yesterday, at the Elements Department, we were discussing these very concepts, and a question arose regarding the Church, the Christian Church as it exists today, and why it was given the right to occupy such an illogically elevated position. What, are all the ascetics and saints astonishing everyone with their purity? No, many of them are greedy for money and material things. In essence, they are corrupt beings with a very limited level of development, at least for the most part. So why is there such a tolerant attitude towards them now? It is precisely because for 70 years they were oppressed just as unjustly as they are now, unjustly being loved. It is the reverse swing of the pendulum, which unfortunately is inevitable. And while this pendulum continues to swing back and forth, sooner or later, the inertial environment of ordinary human thinking will bring it to a stop. If this pendulum is not deliberately swung, it will eventually settle at the 0 point, and attitudes towards priests in the end will become entirely neutral. Well, they exist, so what? The same thing happened with gay people and others with non-traditional sexual orientations. Initially, they were loved and celebrated. Then, with the rise of Christianity, they came to be hated. Now the pendulum is swinging back, and they are loved again, though in a rather different way. However, this has to do with ordinary human thinking. Human consciousness is inert. People do not understand why they once hated gay and lesbian people, and why they now treat them with such tolerance, lauding that tolerance everywhere. And it is the law of the pendulum that makes consciousness feel precisely this way. Yet no one intends to stop this law of the pendulum. And why is that? It is because the consciousness of people who have managed to feel both male and female at the same time is still somewhat higher. In occultism, it is believed that the greatest success in magic will be achieved by those who are able to be both. As paradoxical as this may seem. Nevertheless, in magic, there exists a certain rule. In order for your power not to be wasted, and in order for you to truly become who you can be and are meant to be, everything that happens must remain a secret. It must not be laid bare before others. Yet, what we see now is all for show. It is pretentious, a display of one's otherness in the most primitive and, frankly, horrifying form. And this instantly nullifies all the achievements of a consciousness that has reached the state of androgyny. Now, these people expose themselves saying, "Look at me, look, I have this quality," without realizing that behind this quality stands countless lives already lived. Moreover, those who take part in these gay pride parades and insist that they must happen, just think about the wording itself, instantly wipe out decades of lives in which magical mastery was achieved and in which this androgynous quality was attained. And only those who truly understand where the problem lies and what it actually means, and who manage to keep all this a secret without showing off, are the ones who still have a fairly good chance of preserving their achievements. As for the rest, they simply erase their existential volume once again, and in their next incarnation, they will have to start from scratch, beginning from a very low and unfortunate position, to say the least. For example, they might be born into a family of religious fanatics and be forced to endure that fanaticism. And these will be the kind of fanatics who humiliate women, for instance. For them, the birth of a girl would be seen as a catastrophe. At best, she would be viewed as a future slave in a harem, and nothing more would be expected of her. They will have to endure all the humiliations connected to their gender, because if they were so boastful about it in this life, then in the next life, they will be given the opportunity to fully demonstrate the strength of their, let's say, attachment to their gender traits. Do they behave like this simply because they are underdeveloped and possess low consciousness? No, it's actually a provocation, but they fall for it. Yes, exactly. They fell for this provocation. You know, they're like those Indians who traded gold for glass beads. They simply have the chance to gain fame and perks for free. Well, who could resist that? It's very difficult. After all, consciousness only begins to become aware of a certain kind of memory, let's say, in a somewhat non-traditional sense, beyond the cultural layer, when the time comes. And this usually happens sometime after the age of 40, once the experience of the current life has mostly been formed, and there is at least some understanding of the cultural environment. Then the same androgynous person, having reached a certain age and having experienced within themselves all the sufferings associated with this process, with not understanding their own self, finally comes to realize that all this is no accident. And at that point, memories come and return to them. What lives they have lived, in which bodies, why it happened this way, and why today they have managed to combine both one and the other. However, the cultural environment does not want anyone to rise above it. It knows perfectly well that, by taking advantage of the forces controlling this pendulum and the situation, the pendulum will now swing in the direction of love. And if, when faced with hatred, such people already possess a stable, well-developed algorithm for how to resist, how to survive when you are different and hated, since this was learnt very well back in the Middle Ages, then the question is, how do you survive when you are loved? How do you maintain your own inner strength when everyone around you is saying, "Take it, it's all free, go on, you're so special after all"? How do you resist that? In fact, apart from a few individuals, no one has ever passed this kind of trial, and it is precisely these few who must make it to the final point. This universal, unnatural love is nothing more than a provocation of the system, and only those who can withstand even love will be able to rise to the level of magic. Everyone else will fall.